Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us in today's session called The Just Transition. So today we'll be hearing from three speakers. The first is Fabian Lange, a senior policy officer at the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ. He is part of BMZ's coordination team that is working on just transitions in the context of the Germany G7 presidency. We then have Dr. Daniele Malerba next to me, a senior researcher for the program Transformation of Economic and Social Systems at the DIE. His research focuses on the links between poverty reduction policies and climate change mitigation, with an emphasis on the role of social protection. Daniele holds a PhD from the University of Manchester and regularly collaborates with various international organizations. And then virtually, we've got Margaret Arnold, who is the global lead on the social dimensions of climate change and a senior social development specialist with the World Bank. Margaret has been with the World Bank since 1995 and currently leads work on social resilience, inclusive approaches to climate and disaster risk management, citizen engagement in climate change decision-making, and locally led climate action. And I'm Alexia Faust, and I'm a researcher at the German Development Institute, also focusing on just energy transitions. So today we'll be focusing on just energy transitions from two different perspectives. One will look at the decarbonization of the energy sector as a whole, exploring how to ensure a just transition, especially through the use of different social protection mechanisms. And then we'll be looking at a second perspective, which will lay out the key social and community impacts to consider when decommissioning coal assets. And this is based on experience from World Bank operations and industrialized countries. So without further ado, I will hand over to Fabian, if you'd like to give your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for the introduction. Distinguished guests, dear colleagues, thank you for joining us today for this session on just transition. It's a pleasure for me to deliver the opening remarks for this session, hosted in cooperation with the German Development Institute and the World Bank. And both are long-standing partners of the BMZ. Let me also thank the Friedrich Ebert Foundation for hosting us today here at their lovely premises. I would like to talk about just transition, about the concept of just transition, and why we are supporting just transition as the BMZ, including in the context of the G7, and why we believe that it should play a key role in development policy. The new leadership at the BMZ has put just transition really high up on the agenda. We are promoting just transition as a guiding principle for the global transition to a socially and environmentally sustainable economy. There is no doubt that the transformation towards climate neutral development holds great opportunities for the reduction of poverty, for example, or for the reduction of inequalities. These include gains in, for example, in total employment. That could be better access to sustainable energy sources. That could also be better health for more people. So there are lots of gains, but at the same time, we have significant challenges that come along with this, particularly for the world's poorest. These include, for example, job losses. If people are no longer skilled to execute the work that they are supposed to be doing. And so displacement of unskilled workers is a challenge. Also the social marginalization of affected groups. So it is important that we reduce the social costs of the transition to climate neutrality, while at the same time we try to increase the economic opportunities for the affected groups. In recent decades, the interdependencies between the social and the ecological development have become increasingly clear. The negative effects of climate change particularly affect vulnerable people. And I give you just one statistic. By 2030, between 32 million and 132 million people could fall into poverty due to climate change. So that's a really big challenge. At the same time, the causes of climate change are also linked to poverty and inequality. For example, wealth inequalities are connected to inequalities in contribution to climate change. Just one other statistic, the top 10% of emitters are responsible for close to 50% of the climate emissions, while the bottom 50 only produce about 12% of the total emissions. So it is therefore really important that we link climate and social equity together if we want to foster a just transition that counteracts poverty and reduces inequality. I would like now to talk a little bit about the G7. As you know, the development ministers meeting happened last week. The G7 countries are already supporting partner countries in developing modern and climate neutral energy, including through what we call just energy transition partnerships. There's an example, for example, South Africa, where Germany and other partners of the G7 are collaborating to support the phase out of coal. So this is really this sort of partnership approach that's really important for the ministry that we want to improve and further strengthen, and that was also discussed at the meeting last week. In line with some of the recommendations that we will be hearing from today, from the briefs from Daniele and our guest and Margaret from the World Bank, we'll also the G7 development ministers also committed to other actions that are very much in line with these recommendations. I look forward to the discussions on that later. But I want to touch on a few examples. So first of all, last week, the ministers agreed to support partner countries in setting up and expanding social protection systems. During the COVID-19 pandemic, it has become clear that countries with functioning social protection systems have a higher resilience to crises. So this is really important. They can prevent hunger, they can prevent poverty, and also counteract to the negative impacts of climate change. Second, the development ministers also agreed to direct employment promotion programs towards the creation of green jobs. Why is this important? It's also important because still a lot of employment programs are targeted at sectors that are more traditional sectors, not the green sectors. So it's really important that we act on this and focus more on the sectors of the future. A third example is that the G7 development ministers also committed to strengthening international environmental, labor and social standards along global supply chains. This is important for just transition because about 80% of the global trade takes place in global supply chains. Fourth, the G7 development ministers are supporting the finance ministers in implementing the G20 common framework. The common framework, as you know, allows for coordinated debt restructuring. So this is critical because debt has risen in many countries dramatically as a result also of COVID. And so it's important that we address this point also to be able to invest in SDGs and climate resilience and these sort of things. Fifth, the ministers committed to assist partner countries with the development of appropriate policy frameworks for sustainable finance. And lastly, they will support African countries in setting up beneficial ownership transparency registers. These are important tools in the fight against illicit finance and corruption. So ladies and gentlemen, as you can see from these examples from the G7 process, just transition is an important priority for the BMZ. The goal is really to ensure that the global transition towards climate neutrality takes into account the social dimensions and leaves no one behind. And with this in mind, I would like to take the opportunity to highlight our collaboration with the German Development Institute and also with the World Bank, which culminated in 2 briefs. And we are very happy to present today to you presentations about the findings of the 2 briefs that we've been working on. And so the first presentation will be, I think, by Daniele Malerba from the German Development Institute, and the second then by Margaret Arnold from the World Bank. And I look forward to the presentations and also for the discussion then afterwards with all of you. about the two presentations, and we're really happy also to have this opportunity to learn from you and to seek your input and advice on this very important issue of just transition. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fabian. So now moving on to your presentation, Daniele. You've got around 10 minutes, 10, 12 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexia, and thanks also for the organizer. Done a great job for this conference. So as the three speakers before me, including Axel, have said, just transitions are really at the center of the policy agenda at the moment. And I think that this, in one side, is quite exciting. On the other side, sort of gives us an important role to fulfill at the moment. And this role, in my perspective, and the role that I will have in this panel, is to look how actually just transitions can be made relevant or more relevant for global poverty and global inequality. And today I would like to just highlight 6 main messages that came out from the discussion paper that Fabian was referring to. And one of them is actually quite linked to the current situation of the invasion of Ukraine. So I would like just to give you these 6 main messages that hopefully will spur the discussion for later on. So the first 2 things that I think are very important in terms of just transitions and global poverty and inequality are more on the side of who is actually affected by just transition. So the first message is that there is indeed an overall positive message about just transition, saying that just transition at the end will create jobs. So we'll have an overall net increase in jobs, in a sense that the jobs that will be created are more than the jobs that will be lost. But what is actually missing at the moment, and what is really important for global poverty and inequality, is actually looking at the distributional aspects of these job disruptions. And we found 4 main dimensions that for us are critical to look at. First one is about sectors, because there will be some sectors that will lose jobs. As we know, for example, mining will be a loser of jobs, but there are some other sectors like manufacturing and construction that will see jobs increases. And the important point here is that these sectors are sectors with very low coverage of social protection globally, and are sectors that have a very high rate of in-work poverty, meaning that people do have jobs but are still in poverty. So it's very important that jobs created in these sectors are actually good and decent jobs. Another dimensions that we analyzed was about skills. So it's important really that jobs created can be reached by the poorest through also training and education. Space is another dimensions in a way that, of course, some regions and some countries will lose more jobs, and while others will gain many more jobs than others. And then a final dimension, which is very related to what also was mentioned yesterday in many other panels, is about gender. Because of course the creation of jobs also has a gender impact, as especially the mining or the kind of energy jobs are mostly male focused. And it is important to address this when looking at the creation of new jobs. So my main message here is really that all the positive messages about increasing the number of jobs have to really be downplayed, or at least looked much more in focus with looking at who's gaining the jobs and whether the poorest can actually benefit from this new job. This leads me to the second main message, which is actually quite related to the current situation that we're living at the moment, that we really think that for just transition, there is a need to go beyond a focus on jobs, but actually also look at consumers and increases in prices, as many policies that will drive an energy transition will also affect prices and consumers. And for example, through some calculation, we estimated that the poverty effect of, for example, carbon pricing policy is between 3 and 4 times higher than the poverty effects from just looking at the employment effects. So in a way, if we really are interested in global poverty and inequality, we have to go beyond a narrow focus on jobs and looking at also increasing prices. And this is something, of course, the current situation in Ukraine is really touching at the moment. The third message, which I think is the central one, is about the role of social protection. And as we know also from the European Green Deal, there is a lot of emphasis on the role of social protection on just transitions. And in this case, I think we need to have a sort of double view of the issue. On one side, we need to be very realistic and understanding that especially in lower income countries, the coverage and the effectiveness of many social protection systems is quite low. So in a way, the potential effects of especially active labor market policies or social assistance policies to counteract employment effects or higher price effects are very much potential, and much more work is needed to increase the coverage of social protection system. On the other hand, though, I think we also have to be ambitious, and when we sort of really invest in social protection system, have a very long-term view in order not to sort of do a maladaptation of this social protection system and then have to kind of rebuild again in the longer term. So we need to be both realistic and ambitious when looking at social protection systems. Now, these three main messages, which are quite technical, lead me then to the role of global action and development cooperation for just transition and how this can be shaped in order to have a better effect on global poverty and inequality. So on one side, one message is that the initiatives that we heard today and yesterday, such as climate clubs and also just transition partnerships, need to be fair. And this means fair in terms of rules. So for example, carbon border adjustment initiatives need not to hit and hurt least developed countries, but really need to take into account the needs and the development of lower income countries. And this also needs to be fair also from a funding perspective. For example, our calculations show that if you implement a global carbon tax through global carbon clubs, the per capita redistribution that you will get to the poorest is 4 times as higher as the one that you will get by doing national carbon taxes. And so this means that having fair funding mechanism when doing climate clubs has a lot of potential in relation to global poverty and inequality. But then this is not enough, as global action and development cooperation should also look at social protection system. And one thing that Fabian said was about the recommendation to reach by 2025 1 billion more people and put them under social protection systems. And we know that this is a big gap that there is at the moment, where just 47% of the global population is reached by social protection. And there is a very large gap of around more than $1 trillion per year needed to fill this gap. And there are a couple of initiatives that we recommend the G7 to really push. One is the Global Social Protection Fund, and the other one is the Global Accelerator for Jobs and Social Protection. And we really hope that G7 could push these two initiatives. So this was from a funding perspective. Now, my last 2 points are more about kind of forward-looking agendas. And one is about how to really make just transitions more relevant for some regions. So we know that just transitions are about the energy sector, so how to achieve energy transition in a just and socially fair way. But actually some countries and regions, so for example, Latin America and Africa, have the majority of their emissions coming from land use change, agriculture, or kind of forest. And therefore, we need to really go beyond also the energy sector in order to make just transition a debate that includes all regions and countries in the same way. And this is especially important at the moment, as the global policy coverage of some emission sectors outside the energy sector is quite limited. And so looking beyond the energy sector can also have a very much a poverty-reducing effect. Now, my last point is partially about our kind of research, but is mainly looking at the current situation in Ukraine. And as you know, many governments have announced support packages in order to address the higher energy cost. And many of these measures that the government takes, so around 90%, are about subsidies, while just 10% of them are about cash transfers to lower income households. And while this is, of course, reasonable for the situation and because it's in a way easier, especially in the short term, this poses questions for the long term as, of course, the more these measures such as subsidies are implemented and continue to be used, of course, the more difficult will be to reverse them in the long period. And this is bad both from an environmental point of view, because of course this sort of downplays, especially market signals to kind of change energy sector, but also it's very expensive. And so the recommendation that we kind of ask the G7 to follow through is to actually prioritize short-term measures, especially targeted cash transfers to the most poor and vulnerable. And there is a quote that for me is quite significant, that it has been found that it costs to the governments on average $12 to transfer $1 to the poorest quintiles of the population across country, while it costs $2 of cash transfer to transfer one to the poorest of the for each country. So 6 times more expensive to transfer to the poorest quintiles of the population through subsidies than through cash transfers. So these were my 6 messages, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion later on.
Good. Thank you, Daniele, for sticking to the time. Thank you very much for the points that you've raised. I think for me, what was especially interesting was this distributional aspect, the sectors, the skills, the spaces, and the gender. Because you know, even if green jobs are created for the just energy transition, if they're catered only towards men, it would still be an unjust energy transition, no? So that was very interesting for me, at least. So now moving on to Margaret's presentation.
Great. Hi. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Well, good afternoon. It's really a pleasure for me to join this event virtually and take part in this really important discussion. I'm so sorry to not be there in person. And my apologies in advance if my voice gives out a bit, because I'm still recovering from COVID. So following on Daniele's paper, I'm going to drill down a bit into the energy transition, specifically on the transition away from coal, because and reflect on the World Bank's experience and the learning we've been doing from other countries, including wealthy industrialized countries, around this challenge, because it really presents a sort of dual challenge of transitioning to affordable, reliable, clean energy while also meeting growing energy demand. It's for this and future generations. Lower and middle income countries are developing, and access to electricity is key to creating jobs and supporting vital services such as lighting, cooling, healthcare, better education, affordable broadband. But that the energy used to power people's lives and boost economic activity produces about 3/4 of climate change emissions. And coal is still the most dominant energy source, generating about 34% of global electricity in 2020. So it's really, it may just be the single most important step getting out of coal to limit global warming to keeping it to the 1.5 degrees Celsius. So let me start by saying that addressing climate change is really critical to the World Bank's mission of eliminating poverty and promoting shared prosperity for all. And we have a climate change action plan that commits us to increasing our climate financing overall and making sure that 50% of that is also directed to helping countries adapt. And there's also a big commitment on key transitions. And as I mentioned, the transition away from coal is a priority because of the reasons that I mentioned. So we know a few things, right? And some of these messages will echo what Daniele just presented. So we know that the coal transition will affect millions of jobs, both in the formal sector and the informal sector, both workers that depend directly on coal assets and indirectly in the value chain. So and we also know that beyond jobs, I want to go beyond jobs and social protection a bit here, because the shift away from coal will generate wider spread impacts on communities and regions that have long depended on the sector. There will be cultural, psychological, and other social impacts that have long-lasting effects, particularly in regions that already experience deep inequalities, which characterizes a lot of coal regions, and certainly in poorer countries, and high rates of unemployment and poverty. And while the social protection and safety nets are really critical, we cannot overcome these challenges solely with the provision of subsidies, severance payments, cash transfers, and relocation packages. I don't want to diminish the importance of those, but we can't solve the problem just with that, because we know that individual community identities will be reshaped, in particular where coal mining jobs represent a strong cultural tradition and a source of pride and recognition for workers and their families. And these are families, that have contributed quite a lot to their national and the global economy, but typically have not benefited very much from the sector. So we're talking about potential community upheaval, social tensions, as well as impacts on identity that could lead to harmful behavior such as depression, substance abuse, gender-based violence. So here I want to focus on the lessons we've learned around social sustainability, so which we define as what happens when people feel a part of the development process and believe that they and their descendants will benefit from it. There's a lot of attention on economic and environmental sustainability. We also want to bring attention to the social sustainability aspects, because societies that are more cohesive, inclusive, and resilient, and where decisions are made in a way that is deemed fair and legitimate, all characteristics of social sustainability, they're more effective in working together and building opportunities where everyone can thrive over time. So we believe at the World Bank that this needs to guide our policies for just transmission just as much as environmental and economic sustainability, because this will constrain progress. I mean, these are the aspects that really could make or break whether a transition is effective and whether it is just. So going beyond looking at more the process issues and process legitimacy. So the World Bank has a framework that supports countries to plan and undertake the closure of coal assets, and it's focused around three sort of areas or pillars. One is institutional governance, the second is people and communities, and the third is environmental remediation and the repurposing of former mining lands and other assets. So in each of these areas, there's a set of plans, policies, and actions that together can mitigate the impact of coal mine closure on the environment and on affected people and communities. And we've been updating that framework approach and to reflect and integrate the lessons both from our own experience. We have about 11 lending operations across 2 decades in Russia, in Ukraine, Poland, Romania. And we've also been doing some learning from case studies across other regions in Europe, in the UK, in the United States, and China. And what we found is that the technical challenges are very complex, but manageable, and ignoring the social dimensions that I've been saying could really block progress. And there's sort of 3 really key lessons around that. One is the need to focus, as I said, beyond jobs and focus on regional economic development. The workers are critical, but we need to focus more broadly on the communities where they come from and on long-term economic development. And there's some really good lessons from Germany and other places around that, and having a broader regional economic development approach. The second lesson is around really understanding and addressing the social and cultural dimensions. So all of the aspects that I mentioned previously around identifying and understanding the cultural identity aspects of the region, what it means to be from a coal region, and how coal region communities can develop new narratives of who they are, where they come from, and where they're going. People need to be driving that dialogue for themselves so that they're a part of the process. Because this will affect the social sustainability outcomes in terms of both the poverty distributional impacts on poor and marginalized groups, and looking at the social co-benefits, making sure that they are maximized and equitably shared. So there's a lot of reasons to address the social and cultural dimensions. And then finally, the third key lessons is partnering, developing meaningful partnerships with communities very early on. We have to go way beyond just consulting with community stakeholders at given points in time. That will not be sufficient to ensure a just transition. So in addition to analysis and dialogue, we need to establish strong linkages with community members and local entities, garner their support and input so that they can drive the transformation that's needed to accelerate a fair and inclusive transition. You know, it's a difficult balance, I think, between the urgency and these process issues and the engagement issues, which take time, but we need to invest that time because it won't be as successful. We won't have just transitions without addressing these process issues. So some of the things that we're doing at the World Bank and that we recommended in our approach was around investing in social sustainability analytics, developing supporting local government capacity, revenue and planning assessment and support. So assessing the capacity of municipal governments and regional development agencies to plan and manage coal transitions and partner with communities, supporting just transition dialogues, both at local and national levels to convene multi-stakeholder groups in affected areas to explore and mitigate the social impacts, and also develop mechanisms for accountable transition finance, because hopefully there will be quite a lot of funding. The levels of funding needed to invest in this transition are tremendous, and we need to make sure that it's reaching communities and that reporting is improved and that there's accountability around those. Investing in locally led climate action. So investing in communities themselves and collective action through devolved climate finance mechanisms and community-driven development approaches that can help communities both drive the process, strengthen resilience, and promote livelihood diversification. And then finally look at action learning approaches so that there's flexible learning and that's shared globally to maintain agility in these approaches. So this is all going to take a lot of partnerships, and we're very grateful for the partnerships the partnership and the collaboration we've had with our German counterparts. We're also joining with other multilateral development banks to create unified approaches to supporting just transition for all, and other partners around learning and peer-to-peer learning, and also with the climate investments funds to develop the Accelerating Coal Transition program. So there's a number of programs going on, but there's so much more to do. So we're very much looking forward to working with all the partners. And I'll leave it there. Thanks, Alexis.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. So now we can open the floor for questions. So if there are any hands. Yes, please.
Hello. Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Adama Bamba. I'm a member of Africa Youth Advisory Board on Disaster Risk Reduction. So my question is related to just transition in Africa. I think like when we talk like about go beyond the energy sector, I think that is something that is a bit realistic. But when it comes to energy in Africa, and we know that Africa generally have a kind of huge potential in terms of natural resources. Like let's take an example of Nigeria. They have a power in terms of financial sectors. Like the financial sector is based on, let's say, oil. And if we need, let's say, a shift, a just transition, how this country that is based on oil production are going to, let's say, tackle their own needs, because the money are coming from oil. And then we know that developed countries like use also our material to develop themselves. And now we, youth African, will receive education to see how best we can, let's say, develop from our own resources as well. And then there is a shift. That's the shift that is going to happen. Who is going to manage, let's say, this new transition? And I think also there is a kind of, let's say, challenge that maybe will be between the developed countries. Who is going to hold this new transition in terms of, let's say, financial impact, implementation of this project? So just transition, how it's going to be in Africa, and who is going to manage? Are Africans able to manage the transition, even if we are less polluting? We are contributing only at 4% of the global emission, 4%. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there was one question towards the end.
Hi, thank you. My name is Gina Cortez Valderrama from Colombia, and I am glad that I listened different elements in the conversation, and it was how we're going to link climate, how we're going to link this with social inclusion, and how gender is also going to be a relevant element for just transition. So I am wondering, because we're talking about social inclusion, meaning we're also talking about green jobs that look towards the well-being of the people, right? So how are we integrating care work in the just transition, as a just transition is not only about energy, rather about the well-being of the people, and care work is still, unfortunately, an unvalued, unpaid load, big load that supports our economic and capitalist system. So how we integrate this in just transition? Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think we'll take one question and then we'll try to get answers. So yes, please go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, hi. My name is Yvonne. I work for one of the organizers for the Hebert Stiftung. I'm in charge of international climate policy within FES, and thanks a lot for the interesting presentations and also the excellent questions. My question is actor related. To be honest, I'm a bit surprised that the role of trade unions and civil society more broadly in achieving a just transition was not really at center stage here in this discussion. As you know, originally trade unions are sort of, well, pride themselves as sort of the ones who invented the concept in the 90s in the US. So I was wondering about the role of trade unions in particular and civil society more broadly in achieving that just transition, as they are closely coordinated with the workers on the ground and the communities on the ground, and how that fits into what has been presented here. And also the role of the ILO just transition guidelines that are quite central to this concept that were developed in 2015. How would you relate your findings to those core guidelines? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So if you don't mind taking those questions first, and then we can open the floor to further questions. Daniele?
Thanks for the questions. I think they were all very relevant, and if, the main reasons why probably I haven't touched to them was the time. So maybe I'll start with the first set of questions. And I think you made a point that I didn't mention in the presentation, the one about natural resources for energy transition. So I was reading a report the other day that showed that, for example, if we build electric cars just for the UK, we would finish by 2050 a lot of minerals globally. So the point here is that we definitely don't have to do the same mistakes that we did for emissions with kind of a transition to renewable energy. And we need to make sure that countries have ownership of their resources and also their development. So I think this is definitely a key point. And in terms of your second point about the shares of historical emissions, I think this is really why it is critical to agree and to discuss more about fairness in international climate negotiations. Of course, it's a very hot topic, and there is no kind of legal binding framework, but we really need to kind of improve on that as countries are using different criteria in their NDCs. So that's something that really we need to kind of make a lot of progress in order to actually achieve just transitions, because really historical responsibility and current responsibility is very unequal. This brings me to the second question about the care economy. So on one side, I would really love to open the debate about alternative economic systems, like debate about degrowth. I fear that this is maybe a bit of we are short in time to have a proper discussion. I mean, one thing I can say is that I was maybe surprised and pleasantly surprised that the new IPCC report actually mentions more than the previous one, degrowth. So in a way, we are seeing also some mentions of changing development paradigms, even though I think the role is, the street is quite long to kind of navigate. One thing I want to say is that your point about care economy really also relates to the gender, the gender focus of just transitions. And also, again, I think also relates to the issue of degrowth. So I think really the issue of social reproduction, care work is really something that has to be taken into account much better in terms of just transitions. And then there was the third question, and again, it was mainly a matter of time. And I think the point that I would like to make is that exactly this going beyond energy systems is really difficult, because while in the 70s in the US, trade unions had a very important role in pushing the issue of jobs and environmental improvement, the same is much more difficult, for example, for the agricultural sector. So really improving trade unions across all sectors is a critical issue for kind of more global just transitions. And I think I'll leave it there and I'll pass to Margaret.
Thank you, Daniele. Margaret?
Thanks. Really all great questions. I think Daniele has answered them well. I think what I would add certainly to the first one is, we need to think about just transition at different levels, at the country level, but also at the global level, and really try to make sure that the transition is also an opportunity to address historical, long-standing inequalities and injustices. So in that, I think wealthy countries have to acknowledge their historical responsibilities and deliver on the promise of finance and technology to help poorer countries develop through a net zero pathway, and help them deal with the impacts of climate change that are already being felt. I think for many countries in Africa, it will be the just transition, but maybe more about adaptation, right? And so that needs to be focused on. And for countries like Nigeria, I mean, oil will the demand for oil will peak and diminish, and that's an adaptation that needs to be made also to their economy. So we need to focus on that. So I would say, and the same applies to the care economy and women's empowerment in a just transition, and making sure, because so much of the work that women do is in the informal sector, it's unremunerated, so that needs to be addressed as part of that. And then, well, and the third question, just to say that I think it was a matter of time in terms of dealing with the labor movement. I mean, this did start with them. I think the concept has expanded and been broadened, but that's, you know, the labor movement has always pushed for a tripartite partnership between labor, private sector, and government around transitioning, and that's really critical. I think we would just need to broaden out also to look at the communities where labor comes from and broaden it out a bit. But but they're very critical. Thanks.
Thank you, Margaret. We have time for a few more questions. I think there were two over there. Yes, please.
Mei-Lin Fang, People-Centered Internet. I want to bring in the private sector. I'm really encouraged about this focus on just transition. I'm astounded that the World Bank is actually doing this. And so it's new news to me. And I'm hoping that this actually spreads throughout the World Bank and the development sector. But I wonder whether we can use the emphasis on ESG indicators in the private sector and use what you're learning from the just transition to feed back into making better ESG indicators and therefore drive just transition through the private sector efforts, both in philanthropic, but now the accountability that every corporation is being held to by the hedge funds.
Thank you very much. Shall we take another question? Yes, the gentleman at the back.
Hello, my name is Christian Blut. I work for the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action, and I work on the unit for structural change in coal mining regions in Germany. So thank you very much for the excellent presentations. They've been very interesting and very informative. One thing that we've been trying to do a lot, which you mentioned in your presentation, is involvement of civil societies. Yet the German program for the coal mining regions is actually quite substantial. Yet despite its size and despite trying to involve civil society quite a lot, what I miss when I travel to the coal mining regions is really a palpable sense of optimism, a feeling that this is an opportunity. And I'm worried, how can a program, even a substantial one, succeed if there isn't that sense of optimism? So I was wondering whether you have any insights, any best practices from international perspective, how you can convince civil society that this is an opportunity that ought to be seized.
Thank you very much. And I think we've got, one more. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. Sorry, my name is Laura Banan-Fischer. I'm from the German Council for Sustainable Development. I'm actually wondering if you maybe have an assessment about the future role of hydrogen, green hydrogen, in the just transition process. On the one hand, from an energy perspective, on the other hand, also from the social perspective, which has maybe impacts on the national level, regional level, but also in the realm of global justice and new just relationships, if there can be a potential or if it also gives new risks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we've got 8 minutes until we're due to be done. So maybe 4 minutes for Daniela and 4 minutes for Margaret. Okay, Margaret, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Well, I am not, I am a social development expert in the bank, so I'm not going to try to respond on hydrogen power. I'll respond to the first two questions. One, just on the ESG capacity, and I think it's a great suggestion. It's something that we're actually doing to strengthen ESG capacity of both public and private sectors to support the energy transition. So that is something that we're focused on. We see it as quite critical. We're doing that in Indonesia and a few other places as well. And then on the question on civil society engagement, I mean, it's a great question, and it's, you know, this is such a difficult area, and there isn't a lot of really good practice, right? There's, you know, you mentioned Germany, and the country I come from in the US, we've been getting out of coal for decades, and, you know, in Appalachia region, and there's still I mean, it's the center of the opioid pandemic in the US. There's so many issues there. But I would say that maybe, you know, I think we've seen a shift in global climate governance over recent years with growing voices and engagement of non-state actors, youth leaders, grassroots women, indigenous peoples organizations. And I think we should really embrace that and capitalize upon this shift, because we need these partners. You know, we need to make sure that there are people-centered approaches in this. This is sort of our, you know, we can't miss this shot, and engaging citizens and civil society in this climate decision-making is so essential, both for the political feasibility of climate action and to make sure that the gains and losses are transparent and shared equitably. So I hope we can capitalize that. But you know, I think there's some a few not really large scale, I would say, good practices around civil society and community engagement. But we need to, I think, do more on that to really mobilize it and grow it more. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So moving on to Daniele.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. I maybe like to chip in the second question, the issue about why we don't see such kind of excitement or positive view about this transition. I mean, maybe I give you more a point of view of environmental fiscal reform, so maybe carbon taxes, but I think that can be translated also to kind of shifts from coal. And there are, I mean, two main factors that I think influence that a lot. The first one is information and communication, and the second one is the trust in government and institutions. So in terms of the first one, there is really a lot of misconceptions about the effects of climate policies. And one thing is, for example, there is a recent study in Germany where people really would like the government to recycle the revenues to environmental projects rather than to people, because they really have no faith that the policy itself will reduce emissions, and they also want to earmark the revenues because they have no trust in the government. And this leads to some solutions. So there is the concept of, for example, antedated transfers, where you need to have the correct policy sequencing. So, for example, you transfer first the cash to people, and then you actually increase prices, and then once the policy is established, people trust more the policy and see real the effects. So for me, the main message is it's really a matter about policy sequencing and trusting in government. But I'm very share the viewpoint that there is a lot of kind of negative feelings about this sort of socio-ecological transitions, while I think if you look into the data and studies, is actually a great opportunity in order to sort of transform our societies.
Great, thank you. So I think we've got 2 minutes left, so if we could have closing remarks by all three of our speakers. Maybe Fabian, you'd like to go first?
Oh yeah, thank you very much. And I just wanted to add one point to this last question that was mentioned about optimism. I think what's really important is to add, for example, vocational training programs to give a sense of optimism, a sense of future for those affected communities. So I think that has to be part of the package. Yeah, I would just like to basically thank you very much for these very valuable inputs. I can say that the concept of just transition, as we've also heard today, it has evolved over time. It has started with the unions, and it's much broader now, and it's also a very recent priority for us at the BMZ. So we are still in the learning process. So these inputs are extremely valuable for us, so we are very grateful for that. And obviously, it's not just important in the G7 context, but it goes beyond that. For us, it's one of the political priorities of the minister. So we look forward to keep working with you and seeking your inputs to make sure that we address the issues in the right way, and so that we make sure that we leave no one behind on the way to a just transition. Thank you very much.
Daniele, any final remarks?
I mean, thank you for the very lively discussion. I mean, I think my main point is really when we look at just transitions, I really think it's critical that the social part is not just a residual. So we don't have to make, for example, energy transition and avoiding the poverty increase, but I think that the social part should be the driver of energy transitions. If we don't understand that, I think, and we are not transformational in our approaches, I think that's something we will not reach to have good societies within environmental boundaries. So I just hope that we are more forward-looking and transformational in the context of just transitions.
Thank you. And Margaret, a few final words?
Thanks. Well, thanks to everyone. I enjoyed the discussion and all the questions. I think I would just add that, you know, the climate crisis, it is a social crisis. Climate crisis, poverty and inequality, these are all intertwined, and they're all defining choices of our age, and we have to tackle them together, or we won't be successful in addressing any of them. So yeah, I think that's all I would say. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much to our speakers, and thank you very much to Margaret for joining online, and we'll close the session here.